Make sure to give my dad a 5-star review.
Make sure to like and subscribe to his YouTube. Thank you for listening and enjoy the show.
But the Christian church, if it's going to be a real church in this moment, has to be uncomfortably courageous. It must become uncomfortably courageous. We have to stand up and show that there's a different way. Nonviolent, non-cooperation ought to be the tool that we are using, but it only works best when it's done in mass. And I think that for many Americans, we are very comfortable and we don't like being made uncomfortable.
Hey, welcome back, Faithful Politics listeners and watchers. We are so glad to have you back. I'm your political host, Will Wright, and I'm joined by your faithful host, Pastor Josh Bertram. What's going on, Josh?
Doing just fine. Thanks, Will.
And today we are joined by Bishop Dwayne Royster, who is a pastor and national faith leader working at the intersection of religion and public life. He leads Faith in Action, a nationwide network organizing congregations around voting rights, immigration, housing, and economic justice. He's also done a whole bunch of other stuff, but I'm going to let him talk about that. But today he's joining us to talk about how faith moves into real-world action, and especially in this tense political moment. So we're just so happy to have you on the show, Bishop. Welcome to Faithful Politics.
Thanks, Will. Thanks, Josh. I'm glad to be able to be here with you today.
Yeah, we are too. So give us kind of the origin story of Dwayne Bishop, and like what was the thing that made Dwayne into a Bishop Dwayne and doing the work that you're doing today.
Yeah, thanks. So, I mean, I'm going to tie a little bit of both together because I want to go back to my childhood. If I'm going to reach real far back, I'll try to make it brief. But when I was a kid growing up, my mother was the daughter of a Baptist deacon. My dad was raised by his grandparents mostly, and his grandfather was a Baptist trustee. And I kind of came along in the 60s. I'm old. And my parents loved the Lord, but they weren't really fond of the church. And it was, a variety of different reasons. I think they were the first spiritual but not religious crowd that I really knew. But they really taught us and laid in us a spiritual foundation when we were children. We prayed all the time. We read the Bible together. And my father taught us the first prayer I ever learned to memorize was grace. And, we couldn't touch food before that. But in the early 70s, my mother became a community organizer with a local organization in Philadelphia, where I grew up, that was literally 2 doors down the street from us. And I learned organizing. I learned about justice at a very early age. My grandmother, my paternal grandmother, was frustrated with my parents because they weren't taking her grandbabies to church. So she started taking us to church. And we went to Zion Baptist Church in Philadelphia, which was led by the Reverend Dr. Leon Sullivan at the time. And for those that don't know the history of Dr. Sullivan, he founded OIC, Opportunities Industrialization Center, which became a workforce development program in poor communities. He organized and created the first African-American mall in America, Progress Plaza, which still sits in Philadelphia to this day. In addition to that, he wrote the Sullivan Principles, which governed how the United States dealt with South Africa during apartheid for a period of time. And he was the first African-American on the board of General Motors. I say all that because I want to be clear that he had a very deep social justice lens. And this is back in the 70s and 80s when my grandmother was taking us to church. And so for me growing up, justice and faith were never separate from one another. As a matter of fact, it was the very embodiment of faith to do justice and to love mercy and to walk humbly with your God. And so as I got older, I eventually went to college. I was a student at Boston College, which is a great Jesuit institution. My sophomore year, I was living in a dorm that used to be an abbey, and literally living in a nun's cell. And I was doing classwork for my Old Testament class because everybody had to take religion classes. And I actually had an experience of God and felt called in that moment to the work. But for me, the work was never about, it was Jeremiah chapter 1, verses 4 through 10. I remember that very clearly as if I was sitting there right now. I remember that very clearly, and that's important because it was the work that I was called to do. It wasn't about baptisms. It wasn't about communion. It wasn't even so much about, salvation in the ways that we understand it traditionally from an evangelical perspective. It was very much about transforming the world and changing the world and making it a place where all of us could flourish and thrive and doing the work of justice. And so that's how I got here, through a very long, circuitous route from my childhood until this very moment in time.
Well, I love hearing that story, and I really appreciate you sharing it. Thinking about all the organizing that you learned and how to really embody the faith in terms of taking actions that are, well, actions instead of just words, right? And I kind of think that's where a lot of people, especially me growing up, I was suburban, grew up in a mostly white church, suburban, and essentially it was about preaching, right? Preaching changes people. That's what it was. This word is going to change people. I'm going to preach. It's the gospel. It's the truth. And yet, as I've grown older, wiser, I hope, and better understanding of the scriptures, I see how empty that is. But I really would love to hear from you. Like, why is that empty? Well, I guess one, do you think that's empty? I'm assuming you do because of how you've lived your life. But also, when did you kind of realize that preaching alone won't change things?
That's a great question. That's an awesome question. So I think early in my ministry, so I pastored churches for 32 years before I kind of stepped fully into this prophetic ministry, this social justice ministry full time, although I did it multiple years together. But it was probably in my early pastorate, right? I think I began to question the notion of salvation as an individual act and not as a communal act. And I really began to sense my theology shifting to really begin to look and say, well, maybe this is more communal than it is individual. And so I think, I was evangelical, right? So I graduated undergraduate degree. I didn't finish at Boston College. I finished at Geneva College, Orthodox Presbyterian School, in a place called the Center for Urban Theological Studies, was early disciple of Ron Siders from the Evangelicals for Social Action, right? But I began to question about the notion of salvation being just about an individual act, about me accepting Jesus Christ as Lord and Savior, and that being enough, right? Because it really wasn't just a transformation of the confession, but it had to be a transformation of the heart. But it wasn't just a transformation of an individual heart. It had to be transformation of a community. And then how were we actually going to help people get at liberty? So preaching is not enough. It's never enough. It's a piece of the whole, but it's not the whole in and of itself.
Josh and I were talking right before that we started recording, and there's I don't know if I'd call it an issue, but there's a quandary that him and I both have, and it has to do with the relationship between religion and politics. I mean, we talk a lot on the show about Christian nationalism, a lot. Talk to experts and all kinds of other stuff. Very much against it. Think it's really terrible for the country, for the gospel, what have you. A lot of the reason that we dislike it is because the way that religion is kind of being used in politics. That said, it always feels like whenever I'm talking about like social justice, religion, like, I don't know, like things that traditionally line up with my political ideology. Like, I don't speak about it in terms that I do when I talk about Christian nationalism. Sure. And I'm having a hard time kind of just putting my finger on why that is. Like what is it about using, your faith to push for equality for whatever, and then using religion to say push for like pro-life initiatives?
So, I mean, I break this down in a couple of different ways. Like one, I want to be very clear. White Christian nationalism is not Christianity, right? It's white supremacy using Christian symbols to justify itself. And I think we just have to call that what it is. And so when I talk about white Christian nationalism, and we do a lot of that in Faith in Action. We teach about it, we train about it, we help other people understand it and to explore it. We have to be very clear. It's not Christianity. It's white supremacy that's using Christian symbols to sort of prop it up and justify it as being a legitimate source of faith for people. When I read the gospel, and when I read the Bible in general, both the Old Testament, the New Testament, or the Hebrew Bible, if we want to be correct, the Bible, faith and politics were never separate. They were actually the same thing, right? The religious leaders often were the political leaders of the day as well, right? We see that over and over again, whether we go back to Judges, whether we see David, whether later on we get to the New Testament, we begin to see a bit of a separation between the two. although the Pharisees and the Sadducees still had some, influence with King Herod, we begin to see a separation. But there really is no separation between faith and politics. And faith has a role in the public square. It ought to be the conscience of the nation. It ought to be the conscience of political leaders. And it actually has some demands to make as well. But I have to ask the question, if we're being faithful, are we doing the will of God? And ultimately, what I think the will of God is that people are set free and have experienced liberty, right? That they're experiencing equity and equality. Dr. Y.N. DeCoke, who is a professor of mine at Eastern University where I'm working on my PhD, reminds us that we are all image bearers of God. And so how does our work as people of faith in the public square affirm the image bearers that each and every one of us is? And if it's not upholding the image bearer of every human being, regardless of faith, regardless of language, regardless of immigration status, regardless of language that they speak, if it's not upholding the image bearer status of the individual, then I have to question whether it's faithful, and then I have to question whether it should be in the public square.
I really appreciate that, actually, and I really appreciate the thought of, there are principles that drive how I view what should be out there in the public square, meaning the place where people it's publicly available for people to see it, for them to criticize it, critique it, ask questions about it, critique the methodology. How did you come to this conclusion? All those things, right, that we need to bring out, but that our faith is going to come with us in that, right? Each individual, they're going to bring their faith with them. And this is such a hard question for me because, right, the idea of separation of church and state as we see it, right, is a modern phenomena and a modern idea, right? And I think one of the things to impose on Paul or Jesus 21st century problems or 20th century problems that, not that there isn't some analogy or parallel, obviously there is, I think, and that's why we can apply those things from the scriptures. God's given that. Yeah, we have to be careful, I think, to not just say that Jesus was speaking about our 21st century issues directly, but we have to understand the issues he was hitting in his day. Then through that process of contextualizing, understand how that's hitting us today, because it's the real Spirit of God that's really working within us. And, I've wrestled through the issue of the reason I brought all that up is thinking about this issue of separation of church and state or the political and the religious and how we separate those. And I think you're right. For the individual, they really aren't separated. And when you separate them, it actually probably does violence to both of them in some ways because it's acting as if someone can separate their politics from their most deeply held view on reality. And I don't think that that's possible. I think, and I would love to get your thoughts on this. I think what the problem that I think, Will, you and I find, and what we're trying to figure out is about the use of power. The use of power. The use of power is that's what is so, that's what Jesus talks about, right? How do Christians use power? And that's the thing that's so hard for us, right?
Well,
because it's
go
ahead.
I mean,
please.
Power is a moral neutral. It is absolute moral neutral, right? And I think people, saying, absolute power corrupts absolutely, right? I actually disagree with that. I think it is how people use power. Power is a moral neutral. It is neither good nor bad. It is just there.
Yeah.
And I think that that's important for us to understand. Now, I go back to what I just said a little while ago, right? I believe that Christ came to liberate us and to set us free. And so my judgment about how faith is used in the public square is it liberating people? Is it helping people live? Jesus spent a whole lot of time talking about money and about poverty, right? Is it helping people get out of poverty? And it's not always just pull yourself up by your bootstraps, right? There's accountability on the multiple partners that exist in our community to make sure that our communities are thriving. Jesus, welcomed the stranger. How are we welcoming the stranger right now? And are we also seeing that stranger as an image bearer of God? And
that's a good question.
We know that there are forces that are not doing that right now. They're doing everything they can to dehumanize.
Yes. Yeah, I agree.
And, basically calling everybody that's coming to this country who is not here through appropriate documentation a criminal, which is not the case because it's a civil issue, not a criminal issue. And if that being the case, then all the Europeans that came over here 400 years ago from Europe did not have proper documentation to come into this country. And so therefore, they too would be illegal and would be criminals down to the 4th to 5th to 10th generations that have been in this country already.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I agree. So, and staying in the kind of the same vein of like the Christian response and the times such as these, I'm going to kind of just switch gears a little bit and just talk about like the times that we're in. So recently in Minnesota, there was a shooting of a white woman who, I'm not going to try to pretend I know all the details. Anyways, there was a white woman that was shot by an ICE agent. And there seems to be a lot of thoughts about it, as you would imagine from all sides. I feel really, really inspired when I see religious folks out there speaking up about it. So I just want to kind of get your take. Like, what should the religious response be? When we see something like this happen, regardless of the facts, the details. I don't think anybody should be shot in the face by an ICE agent. Full stop.
No doubt.
So I just love just kind of just help us walk through and work through some of the emotions that have been stirring, at least up in me over the past couple of days as it applies to ICE.
So her name is Renee Renee Nicole Gold. And I just want to say her name because I think it's important to say that, right? She was a human. She was an image bearer of God. She was worthy of dignity and respect. And she was doing what any civilian had a right to do, which was observe the actions of their government while they were, quote unquote, doing their jobs. And I think it is a tragedy, and it is a painful tragedy. We should be mindful, though, that 24 people have died in ICE custody since Donald Trump took office. I just want to be very clear about that. 24 people, not just Renee, it's 24 people. I think people of faith are doing the right thing. They're out in the street. They're protecting their neighbors. They're looking out for their neighbors. They are seeing their neighbors as the image bearers of God and as children of God and siblings of God at the same time that are worthy to be able to try to live their full best lives, to find life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And so I think we actually have a responsibility to hold the government to account in much the same way that Nathan held David to account for his actions. We need to hold the government to account for their actions as well. We need to speak truth to power every way possible. We need to make sure that we're preaching a gospel that recognizes and lifts up each and every human being as worthy of dignity and respect, and that our communities are acting in such a way. Our faith communities and our communities at large are doing that as well. And that we're not allowing stereotypes, we're not allowing lies to be perpetrated in our name and for it to not go challenged at the same time. Jesus protected those that were vulnerable, protected those that were hurting, those that were sick. And so I feel like it's people of faith. It's our job to not only protect them, but actually walk lockstep with them so that they find their own level of agency toward their own liberation in this moment as well.
There does seem to be a little bit of a contrast, and maybe if I'm wrong, please feel free to tell me. But like when Charlie Kirk was assassinated, and again, like that's terrible too. I don't think anybody should be assassinated. Like what's your take on kind of the response from the broader Christian community? When Charlie Kirk was killed versus when Renee Good was killed.
Yeah. So, I think there's a couple of things we need to say. First of all, Charlie Kirk should not have been killed. Point blank, stop, period, end of story, right? That should not have happened. Now, with that being said, Charlie Kirk did a lot of damage to a lot of people by the way that he acted, the things that he said, and the communities that he attacked while he was doing what he was doing. Renee Good was bearing witness. Charlie Kirk was destroying people and working to destroy people at the same time. And I think we need to be very clear that there's a difference between the two of them. She wasn't trying to interfere with ICE operations. She was observing ICE operations. She was asking legal questions. And when the time came, she was trying to get out of the way. She was shot in that process. And I think we have to be be very clear about what was happening with that. Charlie Kirk had no respect for black women, didn't really have respect for black people, did not have respect for immigrants, really did everything he could to basically tear everybody down except for white men who are Christians in this country. And I don't think that that's really the pathway of Christianity either. I think that's an issue of white supremacy. And so I just want to be clear. Charlie Kirk should not be dead, but there's no equivalency between Charlie Kirk and Renee Good in terms of what happened to them.
And so when you're talking about Renee, I wanted to go back into this because, Will and I was talking to him, I don't know if it was yesterday or earlier today. It was probably at some point I was talking to you. And I was thinking about if I knew that ICE was coming into the neighborhood, right, what would I do? And, certainly I don't want that. Certainly I don't think that that's necessary and don't want them to be here. Also, I would certainly let's protest. Let's do do everything we can to do that. And if we're going to in some way impede on the operations, what I would say is that I would expect something to happen. I'm not saying that Renee should have been killed. She shouldn't have. I'm not saying she should have expected to be killed. What I'm saying, or that anyone should have expected her to be killed. What I'm saying is that I probably would have advised anyone coming to me of using a car to block. Now, maybe I'm getting this wrong. She wasn't trying to, you're saying she wasn't trying to impede what they were doing, or was it?
Get out of the way. I think they had told her to move, and she was trying to move. Gotcha. And
that's where I'm there's just ignorance on the actual data,
sure,
right, on the information, which makes sense. But I think that and the reason I'll just say this because there's a comment that we made from one of our listeners, which I appreciate you guys commenting, even when you argue, even when you yell at us and tell us we're terrible. Thank you for commenting and being a part of this. But one of the things that they said was, at what point would you justify, do you think violence against Trump and his supporters is justified? Literally asked me that. And I responded with basically, I don't think it's justified personally. If you're going to do that, I'm just saying we're going to start saying that we're going to start taking up arms. All right, which is a lot of conservatives say, right? What do? Second Amendment is because you can take up arms against a tyrannical government. Okay, right. Well, I'm not going to do that because that's a really good way for me to be killed and my entire family to get killed in the process. Mm-hmm. At our current culture. In our current level of technology, I have a shotgun. I have a rifle, like a 270 with a scope on it that's at my dad's house. It's not even here. And ICE has fully automatic machine guns and all the equipment and power of the United States government behind it at this point, at least the executive branch. And so it's I basically responded I don't appreciate trying to be put into a corner of trying to say that political violence is a public good. If we're going to somehow get to the place where that is the case, I'm not going to ever say, let's go to vote, let's go to protest, let's go to, what did Dr. King do? Nonviolent protest, and it changed the entire society. I know it's sad that we're seeing the same things, but dude, it's undeniable. The same kind of racism in some way that reemerge in all these ways, but it's undeniable that it changed. I'm talking too much. What I'm trying to say is that essentially I'm trying to get down to the tension that many people are probably feeling. Because on the one hand, I'm listening to you and I'm yeah, you're right. I mean, nobody deserves, what the heck? This is their neighborhood. The government is coming in there. What right do they have to just come and do all this stuff? And it's scary. I had a friend tell me that ICE was actually going and looking at cars coming into the church. There was a stop because the cars were stopped and ICE was there. They couldn't go in the church, but they're actually going and looking at his church. And I'm where are we living right now?
Right.
That we're literally afraid of ICE agents knocking on our doors. That should not be America. That's what I'm saying. So I'm definitely in that place. ICE, get out of here with just saying you could do whatever you want. Now, I don't know if I'm being accurate and that's really what they're doing. And see, this is where I feel that tension because I don't know. And I think a lot of people don't know. And we jump to conclusions. And I guess how do we work through, like, what's the line between getting in someone's way or protesting? What is the line in terms of like that you see when we're going out there trying to make a difference? And I'm not trying to trap you in any way. I'm really trying to just understand, like, what do you think that line is?
Yeah, I mean, I think, first of all, so ICE has done some, I mean, I'm based in Washington, D.C., right? So the National Guard's been here, ICE has been here.
Yeah.
I've watched them. They've blocked up streets and set up checkpoints. I have colleagues that literally live on a street that there's checkpoints on both ends of the block, right? So you can't get in and out of the block unless you go through a checkpoint.
It's crazy.
Which is crazy. I mean, this almost reminds me of apartheid South Africa, where you actually show your identification to go in various places, right? This is not the way we should be living as Americans.
No.
Now, let me just say this. I think Christians in particular, and I want to talk about Christians because Christianity has been the vehicle that's upheld this in this particular moment. So I want to talk about the Christians.
I agree.
It doesn't affect all people of faith. But the Christian church, if it's going to be a real church in this moment, has to be uncomfortably courageous. It must become uncomfortably courageous. We have to stand up and show that there's a different way. Nonviolent, non-cooperation ought to be the tool that we are using, but it only works best when it's done in mass. And I think that for many Americans, we are very comfortable and we don't like being made uncomfortable. We don't like going outside of our communities. We don't like dealing with people that we don't know. We don't like putting ourselves at risk. And I think, honestly, that the call in this moment for the church is to be courageously uncomfortable and to allow itself to stand with neighbors that they don't live in. I mean, the United States is deeply racially segregated by its communities, right? Both by economics and by race and by ethnicity. But what does it mean to stand up for your neighbor? I mean, please don't tell me you plan on going to heaven where there's going to be all kinds of people coming together, all different races and nations and nationalities, and we're all going to worship and live together, but you can't do that down here. So I think we're in a moment when we actually have to learn how to model as on earth, as in heaven, right here, right now, and to be and to become courageously uncomfortable. Jesus did it. He modeled it for us. The disciples did it. They modeled it for us, and we will have to do likewise.
I just two questions. One totally unserious, but it's because I have a little bit of OCD, ADHD. Are all those books behind you green on purpose?
One of my colleagues came in and color-coded my books, which really upset me because I came in, they put the office together, they were color-coded.
I was going to...
And I'm like, I can't find my stuff.
It looks so color-coded. You're right, dude. You're totally right. It's amazing.
They're all color-coded, like yellow, red, green, purple, blue. This blue one is down there. Yeah, my colleague did that, and I was like, what did you do? And I had everything set up by categories, by different... And they
well, you can tell them that it's noticed. You know, if I could add if I could add anything, you know, I would sort of arrange them sort of symmetrically, but you know that's just me. Anyways, the serious question: with you being in DC and sort of the ICE presence there, like what are the faith leaders saying about like the impact on their congregants, you know, I mean, I just imagine having like this full like force coming to DC to include like the flags and banners of Trump's face, you know, hanging over the sides of the buildings and stuff. Like what are the other pastors in your network talking about?
Yeah, so we have an organization here called Congregational Action Network led by the Reverend Julio Hernandez. And I was actually just with Julio on Friday. We did an action outside the White House, a press conference outside the White House calling for the Trump administration to end ICE, give the information, the video footage and all the information to the Minnesota Attorney General and the district attorney in Minneapolis area. And, you know, we have almost 100 congregations that are part of that work that are working to fight against ICE, well, to fight for, I shouldn't say fight against, they're fighting for their neighbors. They're fighting for their neighbors, right? They're doing Know Your Rights trainings. They've in past provided sanctuary for folk that did not feel safe anymore. But since the United States no longer respects religious institutions, hospitals, and schools, as vehicles, like there's a challenge with that now. They're doing everything they can to help people with legal services to be able to get access to a lawyer to do what they need to do to try to get through the system in this particular moment. And they are protesting. They're taking to the streets. There was a big action here on the Woodrow Wilson Bridge where faith communities from across D.C. went from D.C. into Virginia and back on both sides to stand up and say very clearly, we want ICE out. We want the government out of the business of haranguing and actually acting as domestic terrorists towards these folk in our communities that are deserving of due process under the law. So, yeah, they've been very active, very frustrated. And we have to say, too, I mean, I want to be very clear. D.C. was Chocolate City. The largest group in the Washington, D.C. area is African Americans, and that number is dwindling, especially as the violence and as people are saying, I've had enough. You know, we've had several 100,000 jobs lost as the government is reducing its size. And a lot of those were Black women that lost their jobs at the same time in this region. And it's hard to stay here when you can't afford to stay in the D.C. area any longer.
No, you can't stay there. I mean, I grew up in Chantilly, Virginia, which is like 20 miles from D.C., right? My dad was born in D.C. and lived there. I was born in Bowie, Maryland, right outside of D.C. Yes, Prince George's County. Mm-hmm. And it's like, yeah, there's no, you can't live there if that's happening. And man, all of this is just so heartbreaking. It's just so heartbreaking. And it makes me wonder, like, why is this going on? What happened? What is this a reaction to? Is this a reaction to someone or something? I've heard that, I guess I'm being a little bit leading in that, what I'm saying there, because I do think there is like a reaction that's happened from like the Obama days, and I could be wrong with this, but it is my intuition that there's this reaction to that right now. But I don't know. What do you think? What's going on? What's happening right now? Because it felt like when I was in high school, like this couldn't have happened. What's going on right now? But I could be totally ignorant and wrong on that, right? So that's from my perspective. What do you think?
Yeah, I think Obama exacerbated something that had been in the works since the 70s, right? So, I mean,
interesting, yeah.
Started the Southern Strategy right in the early 70s. He did it with the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. There was a whole plan, to basically retake back the country. In the early 80s, the Christian right got engaged with the moral majority. And then folk like C. Peter Wagner, who was out of Fuller, began talking about the Apostolic Reformation, which became the modern day version of white Christian nationalists, right? And so then we have 8 years of an African-American president. And I think that was the tipping point for folk, that it was going too far. Dr. Steve Ray, the former president of Chicago Theological Seminary, did a theopolitical analysis of this moment with the Faith in Action leaders some time ago. And he said, really, since the civil rights era, this is the first time that America really began the process of operating as a multiracial nation. We began to see women in leadership, people of color get into leadership. We saw economic mobility in a lot of those communities as well. We began to see the integration in terms of our politic, people getting elected to office for the first time in major cities and then states and then federal government level as well. And we began to see a vast integration, a multiracial democracy emerging from all of this. But it was some years ago, actually probably after the George Floyd protest, in things, that there was a white pastor who wrote an opinion piece in the Huffington Post when he said, and he was pointing to his own community, he said, for white folk, equality feels like a demotion. When you have been raised and taught that you are better, and it's not necessarily, it's in the water, right? The caste system in America is everything that we do. But when you begin to see others that you've been taught aren't as good as you become equal to you or even leading you at some point or another, then you begin to see people begin to rise up. And so I don't think Obama was the cause of this. I do think it was the tipping point. President Obama's 8 years in the White House as leader basically of the free world for all intents and purposes, the way that he did it without scandal, without a whole bunch of other things that other administrations have done, modeling for us what whole families look like. I mean, his family was whole. They were very intact, even extended family, because his mother-in-law was with them at the same time. modeled something that I think for a lot of people, they felt like they shouldn't be modeling because the story about African Americans wasn't what the Obamas were showing us. And so I think that there was a way that we then have to begin to tear that down. I mean, let's be honest, Donald Trump was tearing at Barack Obama when he first got elected, right? Challenging his citizenship, challenging all kinds of things. So there began to be sort of deeper rumblings, but that rumbling then took on character of building political power. And then, taking over a political party for the purposes of exercising that power in ways. But this started with Richard Nixon writing the Southern Strategy back in the early 70s to fight back against what President Johnson did with the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act to begin to take the country back. Ronald Reagan actually was the vehicle that began to move that in a deeper way and aligned both right politics and right theology in his partnership with Jerry Falwell and others, Ralph Reed and others who formed the moral majority. He began that deeper tie in bringing those two communities together. And then I want to add in sort of the libertarian billionaire class that then now began the process of both funding the conservatives and also funding conservative faith communities at the same time so that they could all operate together to bring about a very powerful transformation in this country. And it just took them a couple of decades to build towards that.
That is an amazing distillation of like kind of the origins of the religious right and kind of like the moment that we are in today. I mean, like kudos. I got to give you lots of credit. There's a ton of history that you just like included in there that, I mean, this would be like a 24-hour episode if we touched on all those little parts. But But with that though, I am curious about like your position as a faith leader, as someone that's been in the ministry for a while, that I've got no doubts that you seriously care about people and are living out the gospel. But yet you have like folks like a Franklin Graham who are saying stuff specifically about, not just, the Department of War and sort of like God's views on war, but also like, kind of tanking on the characteristic of good, and sort of like trying to paint this person as some domestic terrorist, like the White House is doing. So how do you combat that? I mean, like Franklin Graham, huge person, like huge platform. A lot of Christians still look towards, like his work and what he does. And then there's like everybody else, like all the other smaller faith leaders that don't have a huge, multi-million-dollar ministry or something like that. So like, how do you kind of reconcile, the work that you're doing when you're going up against a message from similar faith leaders, who have a much bigger platform?
Yeah, sure. I mean, again, Franklin Graham, one of those folk that's deeply tied to that whole, white nationalism structure, tied to the structures of the billionaires that are supporting ministry leaders, tied to the conservative political apparatus at the same time, right? He's all caught up in that as well. Let me just say this. So Christianity was never intended to be the religion of the empire. It did not start out that way. And for the first 300 years of its existence, it was actually, and for most of it, not all of it, but most of it, it was a tortured faith community, right? People had to be faithful and they were being tortured by the empire. It wasn't until Constantine in the 3rd century actually begins to make it the religion of the empire that we begin to see this transformation. I believe the truest form of Christianity predates those days of Constantine, when it was about real people struggling every single day, people on the margins, on the edge that nobody wanted to deal with, or the people that others looked down on. And it was never intended to be the religion of the empire. It wound up that way. Now, it doesn't have to be. It can actually still be the religion of real everyday people. Jesus, when he was born, wasn't born in some, vast, medical institution for their day. He was born in a barn, right? He was born in a stable. He grew up amongst everyday common people. His stepfather had a common everyday job. He had to learn a craft. He was a worker. He would be defined as a worker, right? Probably a member of a trade union if he were, if they had him back in those days, a guild. So the religion and the faith was shaped by somebody who was deeply familiar with everyday common people. He wasn't hanging out with the millionaires and the billionaire class. He wasn't hanging out with the royalty and the religious elite. He was hanging out with everyday people. And I think that there's something to be said for that in this moment as well, that we need to really reclaim. Who are your friends? Who are you hanging out with? Who are you talking with? Who are you thinking with? And here's the other thing that I think is important for us to understand too. There can be multiple ideas of faith that can exist simultaneously, and they can all be right. Because the experience of communities are different, the ideas, there's no such thing as a pure Christianity, because everything we have is actually done through a lens of European theologians, through Constantine. And so to get back to the purest sense of our theology and to decolonize it, we have to go way, way back, long before that ever happened. And so I think that there's this moment that we're in right now where we have to really ask ourselves the question, like, what are we doing? And who are we standing with? And is this who God would stand with? And be very close to the gospel with that for those of us that are Christians. Not everybody's a Christian, I understand that. But for those of us who are Christian, how are we lining up with the will of God? And I don't know, I didn't see Jesus lining up with the religious elite. I didn't see Jesus lining up with the rich and the affluent. I saw him hanging out with everyday folk. Mm-hmm. He was accused of being a wine bibbler. He was accused of hanging out with prostitutes. He was accused of hanging out with no good folk. Mm-hmm. Are we doing likewise?
I mean, that's a great challenge, dude, and I love it. And you're absolutely right. The table fellowship from what I understand, the table fellowship that Jesus engaged in with those people that were considered unclean and those people that were not within the good graces of the religious establishment, that's essentially what got them so angry at him that they turned him over to be killed, was part of what did, because he gave too much acceptance and power to those categories of people that, if they had that, could really affect the religious system in everything. You could see how people would try to think about the greater good and justify the means. Like, why are you allowing this to happen? It's going to create chaos. Sure, maybe it's nice in one instance, but is this going to create chaos for everyone? And you're like, but Jesus went through all those excuses, right, that we make to hold on to power. All of us want to do it because once you have power, it's hard to let go of it. And I think that's the lesson for all of us. What do you think is the most important thing that you would want to say? Most important thing, maybe what's a really important thing that you want to say that you felt like you haven't said or want to reemphasize for our listeners as we're moving into 2026, right? It's the 1-year anniversary. We got 3 more years of Donald Trump. If you love him or hate him, he's either 3 more years unless something happens that we're not aware of. So this is what we have for the next 3 years. So what's your call? What do you want to say?
So I specifically want to talk to our Christian siblings here for a minute, or those that claim Christ, that in this moment, we are called to become courageously uncomfortable. There are seasons that the church has existed in. There are difficult seasons. There have been easy seasons. And for the church in America right now, we actually have to have a confrontation with ourselves and ask ourselves the hard question, are we doing the will of God? Not what somebody taught you, but what you know from the scripture text and what you know in your heart by the power of the Holy Spirit. And then are you willing to see every other human being as an image bearer of God? Are you willing to come together, to organize, to build power together, to push back a faithful power? Let me just not talk about general power, but a faithful power that bears a powerful witness, in much the same way that Nathan did when he went in and confronted David. A faithful power that will go in and confront the powers and the principalities, the rulers of darkness in high places, and call them down. Because that's what we're called to do in this moment. And so that is what I do as an organizing, faith-based community organizer with our organization that exists in 26 states, 40 different organizations in 13 countries around the world. We organize people every day to control the destiny of their communities by making sure people are set at freedom and at liberty and that they're able to live their full best lives, which I believe God intended for each and every one of us. And so I invite everybody to step into that right now. Congregations, religious leaders, pew sitters. It's not enough to pray. Frederick Douglass said, I prayed and I prayed and I prayed. And then I got off my knees and prayed with my feet. And when I did that, things began to change. And I think we're called to do that in this moment as well.
Yeah, that's really well said. And I agree with you 100%. How can people connect with you, your mission? You mentioned what you guys do to organize. This is kind of your time to sell the organization that you do. And yeah, sell yourself here. Let people know how they can follow you.
So they can find us at www.faithinaction.org. That's www.faithinaction.org. If you want to email me personally, it's bishop@faithinaction.org. It's bishop@faithinaction.org. You can find me there. You can find us at FIA National on Instagram, on Facebook, on Twitter, on Blue Sky. It's FIA National. You can find us in all those places and reach out to us. We want to be in dialogue. If you're actually interested in getting engaged and we don't have a local entity in your community, let's talk about how we can create one together and begin to build that faithful power that can speak truth to power and really call for righteousness in the land. So we really want to get engaged with people as much as possible. Again, bishop@faithinaction.org is my email. I look forward to receiving your emails and being in dialogue with you.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Bishop, for being on the program. Man, it's been such a great conversation.
Love it. Thank you so much for having me, Will, Josh. It's been a great time together.
Absolutely. And to our viewers, guys, we'll have all of those links in the description and show notes, so you can check that out. Make sure you're looking at what Bishop is doing and getting involved and helping in whatever way that you can in this time in your life right now. And thanks for joining us. We couldn't do this without you. You're the best. And until next time, keep your conversations not right or left, but up. God bless.